All right, so this is episode 3 on justice, where we're going to look further into Locke's political theory. So in the last episode, we saw that Locke thinks that the state of nature is not a state of license, it's a state of law. There is law that exists in the state of nature, law about protecting life, liberty, and so on, property, and so on. And Locke tells us that people are entitled to enforce their rights in the state of nature. And this leads to a problem. It's actually curious the way Locke approaches this. He doesn't say the problem with the state of nature is that there's a lack of enforcement. He says the problem with the state of nature is that people get to enforce their rights themselves, and that this leads to a problem. The problem being that, in effect, they become judges in their own cases, and that will generate conflict, and that this is what has to be given up to the state. What has to be given up to the state is the right to be a judge in one's own case. And you can see Locke saying that here. Unfortunately, it's a rather long passage, but anyway, here we go. Man being born, as has been proved, with a title to perfect freedom and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, equally with any other man or number of men in the world, hath by nature a power not only to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men, but to judge of and punish the breaches of that law in others, as he is persuaded by the offence deserves, even with death itself, in crimes where the heinousness of the fact, in his opinion, requires it. But because no political society can be nor subsist without having in itself the power to preserve the property, and in order thereunto punish the offences of all those of that society, there and there only is political society, where every one of the members hath acquitted this natural power, resigned it up to the hands of the community in all cases that exclude him not from appealing for protection to the law established by it. And thus all private judgment of every particular member being excluded, the community comes to be umpire, and by understanding indifferent rules and men authorized by the community for the execution, decides all the differences that may happen between any members of that society concerning any matter of right, and punishes those offences which any member hath committed against the society with such penalties as the law has established, whereby it is easy to discern who are and who are not in political society together. Okay, well, obviously that's a bit of a mouthful, but let me just explain what I think the key elements are for our purposes. The first thing is that, of course, as we know, rights exist in the state of nature, according to Locke. And Locke holds those rights are enforceable. But the only way that they can be enforced effectively is through individuals enforcing rights for themselves, and that generates conflict. So what needs to happen is that the ability to enforce one's rights needs to be given up to the sovereign, to a state, to a government that enforces those rights for us. As Locke puts it, the community becomes the umpire. The community becomes the umpire. Now, this is an interesting, I can't tell you whether Locke had this in mind or not, but when I came across this phrase, the umpire, it struck me as interesting because in sport generally, though this isn't universally true, there's a distinction in sport between umpires and referees. And it may be the case that Locke is appealing to this, but I don't know, but it's worth thinking about anyway, because it'll raise an issue that we need to discuss later. So generally speaking in sport, the distinction between an umpire and a referee is that the referee's decisions are final, whereas the umpire's decisions are not, or at least in principle not final. So in a sport like cricket, for example, where you have umpires, or tennis, where there is an umpire, the decisions of that umpire can technically be overruled by the match referee. Whereas in a sport like rugby union, the decisions of the referee on the field are final. Okay, now what Locke is telling us is that the community becomes the umpire, but notice it's the umpire and not the referee, which seems to indicate, if we take this analogy with sport seriously, as maybe we shouldn't, but it seems to indicate that there's still a referee there somewhere. There's still a final person who gets the final say. The community is the umpire, but there is something else there, somebody else there who gets the final say. And as we'll see, I think this is actually Locke's position. Okay, so in any case, umpires can get things wrong, right? We know that right from watching sport. Umpires can get things wrong, and the question is what happens when they do get things wrong? And well, we'll see. We'll get there. Now, there are at least two big problems with this idea. The first is this. Let's go back to what the argument was. Remember that the argument was, we're all God's property, so therefore we're all equal. Well, we're all God's property, so therefore we're all equal. Now, I have to say that on the face of it, that doesn't seem a very strong argument to me, even if you agree with the premise. So even if you agree that we're all God's property, it doesn't seem to me to follow that we're all equal. I mean, why can't we be all God's property and be unequal? I mean, maybe God favors some property of his property over others. It doesn't seem to me it follows from the fact that we're all God's, even if it is true that we're all God's property, that we're all equal. Now, Locke tries to deal with this problem by appealing to Scripture, and we'll return to this. But immediately we can see that too is a bit, more than a bit, problematic. It's problematic in Locke's day, and it's even more problematic today. Because, what do you do, for example, about people who don't believe in God, or believe in a different God, or believe in the same God that you believe in, but have very different ideas about what that God commands? And as we'll see, Locke has an answer to this, but it's a very curious one. And it's just, although in many ways the theory that we've looked at so far seems very modern, Locke's answer to this really crucial question is very unmodern. And it's one that I think is not likely to appeal to anybody today. So Locke asks himself the question, what happens if the state acts unjustly? This is a big issue for Locke. You think about the times that he was living through. I mentioned the exclusion crisis in an earlier episode, and also the situation in England after the Glorious Revolution. It's very much in Locke's mind. But what should happen? What should be the case? What should one do if the state acts unjustly? And this is what he tells us. He says, wherever violence is used and injury done, though by hands appointed to administer justice, it is still violence and injury, however coloured with the name, pretences, or forms of law, the end whereof being to protect and redress the innocent by an unbiased application of it to all who are under it. Wherever that is not bona fide done, war is made upon the sufferers, who having no appeal on earth to right them, they are left to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven. So what Locke's saying here is that if the government violates your natural rights, that is an act of war against you. So if the positive law is inconsistent with your natural rights, that is an act of war against you. Now, the question then is, well, what does that mean? What is the significance? What is the consequence of an act of war? If the government, because by Locke's light, the current government in New Zealand, especially now we're under lockdown, it is committing an act of war against me, in Locke's view. So what's the consequence of that? Now, what it means, clearly in Locke's view, is that the government has no authority to do this. But then, what does that mean exactly? What is the consequence of that? What is Locke saying here? Is he saying that one is, in these circumstances, one is morally obliged to obey the positive law and accept the injustice, and one will just have to wait for justice in the next life, one will get rewarded in heaven? Or is he saying that there is no moral obligation to obey the law, that this is a state of war, and so the government's authority has effectively ended, right? And that we have an obligation, in fact, to revolt, to conduct some kind of revolution? Now, there's room for different readings of Locke here, but it seems to me, for what it's worth, that he is advancing the second view, that the unjust act on the part of government justifies a revolution. Now, my question is this a tenable political philosophy? Think about issues such as taxation, or gay marriage, or the controls on the sale of property, let alone the current lockdown, and so on. Now, it's very common that people think that these things are, that whatever the current position is of the government, whatever it is, whatever the tax rate is, whatever its position on gay marriage is, whatever the position on the controls of property is, whatever the position of a lockdown is, on the lockdown is, or whatever the position of the government is, lots of people will think that the government's position is unjust. Okay? Now, the question is then, who gets to decide what should be done? Locke seems to be saying we get to decide. So if I get to decide that the government is acting unjustly, I can reject the government's position and I can revolt, justifiably revolt. And he seems to be saying that, for example, here. He says, "Who shall judge whether another hath put himself in a state of war with me, and whether I may appeal to heaven in it? Of that I myself can only be judge in my own conscience, as I will answer it at the great day to the supreme judge of all men." So what Locke seems to be saying here is, if I believe that what the government is doing is unjust, then I'm perfectly justified in disobeying the law. Now, you might, I think, for what it's worth, right, my view is that this is a completely untenable political philosophy, because remember, what I take to be Hobbes' central insight is that politics is about learning to live with people who fundamentally disagree with you, and that is going to require agreeing with people to do things that I personally think are wrong sometimes. Hopefully not hideously wrong, but nevertheless things that I think are somewhat unjust. I'm going to have to accept that if I'm going to get on with people, if I'm going to be able to live with people who have radically different views than I do. Now, and so Hobbes would say, for example, Locke this is a hopeless philosophy because it doesn't deal with the central political problem. Now, Locke's response, he would have had a response to this, but it's a very, very curious response. And I think one that, in my opinion anyway, we simply aren't able to accept today. Locke wrote in a number of areas in philosophy. He wrote lots of things. He wrote on moral philosophy, in political philosophy. He wrote in epistemology and all sorts of different areas. But he didn't write on ethics. And this is a sort of a glaring hole in his philosophical work. He wrote no stuff on ethics. And when one of Locke's friends wrote to him once and said to him, "Look, you've never written in this area, and it would be really good if you did, produce a work looking into the truths of ethics." And Locke responded that it wasn't necessary to do that. There was no need to produce any kind of moral philosophy, ethical philosophy, because, as he put it, quote, "The gospel contains so perfect a body of ethics that reason may be excused from that inquiry, since she may find man's duty clearer and easier in revelation than in herself." So, in other words, Locke thought that the moral truth was actually crystal clear. And so he thought that anybody who disagreed with him could not be being sincere. Locke did not believe in the existence of sincere disagreement about these matters. And so he thought that opposition was evil. And I think as a result, he advances a kind of political fundamentalism. He hasn't learned Hobbes' essential lesson that politics is about learning to live with people who disagree with you. And I think the fact is that in this way, Locke has to be described as a pre-modern philosopher. Right? He thinks that things are just settled, and if only we could be sincere, we would all agree. And I just think that view is completely unbelievable. So in the end, a problem here with Locke's view is we're offered a natural law theory without any real argument. He doesn't think he needs to provide an argument because he thinks it's all there written in the Bible. The problem is, as we've seen, there are plenty of people who don't believe that the Bible is the word of God. They might not believe there is a God. There are people who believe in different gods, and there are people who read the same Bible, who believe in the same God, who come to different conclusions about what our natural rights are. So I don't think Locke's strategy is going to, my own view is that it's really, how can I put it, entirely unsuccessful in this regard. All right.